Welcome to Life with Beth and Court,
where we teach you how to live authentically and build your best life.
one step at a time.
What are we mic checking with today on this winter wonderland of a day?
Well, we have a choice. We can either go funny or we can go serious. What are you thinking?
Oh, I always choose funny.
Well, here's the thing. Do you remember that song from when we were kids? I think it was on Sesame Street about a flying purple people eater.
Nope. No, I don't.
You never remember the good songs from Sesame Street. You don't remember the water one.
I don't know that I remember Sesame Street. I don't know that I watched it.
You did.
I don't know that I was a child.
Every kid watched that show.
I only remember from about like 9 on.
Anyway, there was this giant mascot which had one horn and one eye and like this purple cape, and it was really fuzzy, and it was running around on the TV, and the children were like super excited, and the song went like this. It was a one-eyed, one-horn flying purple people eater. And looking back, what I visualized it as, it was horrifying. So I don't know why we thought it was cool as children. So what I was going for was, it was a one-eyed, one-horn flying perfect people pleaser. That's what I was going to do.
Well, that's tough.
I couldn't land it.
Yeah, that's tough.
So why don't we just go the serious route?
Oh, that was our only funny option?
We're just
okay.
going to shift because
All right.
I'll see if I can land it at the end, but I just don't think I can get there. Ready? Pretty, pretty, please, don't you ever feel like you're less than perfect. Pretty, pretty, please, if you ever feel like you're nothing, you are perfect to me.
Pink. Whew.
Yeah, that one wasn't easy either.
I love Pink because she's like the epitome of a badass.
I really don't care for her.
I know you don't.
She's not my kind of badass.
She's just like, I don't know. I feel like she also isn't too in my face about it because she stays out of headlines for the most part. You know what I mean?
That's true.
She's not like breaking beer bottles and starting bar fights or anything. She's just like, hey, don't mess with me. I'm going to be over here. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
All right, let's get down to it. Welcome back to another episode of Life with Beth and Court. I'm Beth.
I'm Court.
And today we're talking about people-pleasing perfectionism. It is cancerous.
It is. And this is like, I don't know what's going to come out of me during this because this topic is like very near and dear to me and emotional. So I've got my tissues, I've got my tea, like I'm prepared for whatever happens emotionally, except I just bought these really cool fake eyelashes. And this is only my second time wearing them. And I don't know if they would survive that kind of emotion. So it might get a little messy.
Well, I feel as if any good fake lash could last through a cry sesh, no?
I don't know. I've never had them before. These are magnetic and they were like $15. So probably wouldn't bank on it, but we can find out.
You definitely brought the comfort stuff, so that's good.
Sure
You're
did.
prepared for whatever happens today.
Yep.
So the interesting thing about perfectionism is I think it shows up differently for a lot of people, and I think it showed up differently even for you and I.
Oh, for sure.
And so we get a lot of questions. We get a lot of direct messages, emails, texts, people talking to us in person. And we get people who ask a lot of questions that if we continually ask why and dig deeper and deeper, it gets back to ultimately perfectionism.
Yeah.
Right. And so we wanted to address it today because it broke us.
Yeah.
Individually, thank God it broke us at different times in our lives so that we didn't break at the same time. But for me, my journey with perfectionism, which came out through a performance complex, was back when I was, I crashed and burned when I was in college or just out of college. So that's when mine really came out. When was yours?
Pretty hot and heavy until like a year and a half ago.
Oh,
2 years ago.
Yep.
Like pretty recent.
All right. Yep.
Yeah.
I don't know why I was surprised by that. I was there for it. I don't know. The timelines sometimes they disconnect from reality in my head. So,
well, and one thing I've noticed lately, my friend and I were talking about this the other day, how sometimes you get so far. Oh my God, it was you. I was talking to you about it.
All right.
I think it was a friend also additionally. Anyway, I was having conversations about how when you move so far beyond something you struggled with and you're on the other side of it, you totally forget how terrible it was while you were in it. Like you have an idea and you're like, oh, that didn't feel nice. But like it's nothing compared to what it was when you were in the depth of it. And so it's just really interesting because perfectionism drove my entire adult life as far as I can remember. And actually for me, I remember it starting back in childhood. And so I was thinking about it, like, why is this so important? Where did it come from? And the first thing I thought of was how I was praised growing up. See what I did there? Like raised growing up, but praised. Thought that was pretty funny. So,
wow, you're so clever.
well, and think about it. So when kids are little, a lot of the times we hear like, wow, you were so good at that. And wow, you did a great job. And so as children, we learn that what our caregivers and our parents think is important. So if they're saying, wow, you're doing great, you're really good at this, you start saying, oh, I want my mom to be proud of me. Or like, oh, I want that to continue. And so that's why from an early childhood standpoint, we talk about praise versus encouragement, because encouragement is focusing on how they're getting to the process, what they're doing on their own, and just simply bringing awareness like, oh, you worked really hard on that instead of you did amazing. Because the thing with perfectionism is it's very black and white and very distorted. There's no gray area. So for me, like if I would miss scheduling something on the CEO's calendar, which is kind of like a big thing, like say it was an important meeting, versus if I forgot to call a member back or I forgot to do something like that, the level of crappiness behind it is the same in my mind. Like even if it was a big screw up or a little screw up, the fact that I screwed up was the underlying factor.
Yeah. My perfectionism, I think, came through sports for me, because when you go back to, when you're talking about growing up, I was a pretty good athlete. And I was little and I was scrappy and I played hockey. And so it was unique to have girls playing hockey. And, I prided myself on being able to keep up with the boys and hold my own on the ice with them. And I was just a good athlete. I picked sports up quickly. Moving my body comes very natural for me. Even just things like weightlifting form, it just comes naturally to me. And so I used to get that a lot. I used to get parents, my parents, other people's parents complimenting me. I would hear things like, wow, Tommy, she really kicked your butt on the ice today. And I remember feeling like, I did. Yeah. And so I ended up putting all of my self-worth in that basket. And I also got good grades and whatnot in school as well. But my brother's fairly intelligent as well. He didn't really try as far as grades, but I knew that he was smart. So even if it didn't show in his grades, I knew that I probably wasn't going to be the standout on intelligence. And the same for my younger sisters as well. They're both brilliant too. So in my family, intelligence wasn't really where I was like, oh, I'm going to get the standout marks on this, but athleticism was. And so I would train and train and train. And I ran into some really serious health issues. And at the time, they didn't even have them diagnosed. They didn't even know what was happening with me. But I was 17, I think. And I had to do like 3 months of my senior year at home because something was happening around second hour every day. And like, I couldn't stay conscious. And that is typically pretty scary for a parent. And I remember my mom like forbidding me to go to hockey practice. And I would say, I hope she's not listening right now. I would tell her that I was just going up to practice to encourage my teammates and be there for their support. But I would sneak my skates and stick and helmet into the car before I would go. And then I would get up there and all I wanted to do was skate. And of course my coach was like, what are you doing? You're not supposed to be on your skates. And I was like, just don't tell my mom. But anyway, even when my body was beginning the journey of breaking down, I wouldn't stop because that's where I got my praise. That's where I got my affirmation. And so I took that to the extreme levels all the time.
Yeah. From a societal perspective with sports, that's the case. And let's talk about academics, because even though you're saying like you weren't the intelligent one or whatever you were saying, which is crappy self-talk. I'm just going to call that out. But anyway.
I didn't say I wasn't intelligent. I said that my siblings are also intelligent. So that wasn't what was going to make me stand out.
Well, but so look at the grading system. So you submit your homework and you're rated on a scale of, in grade school, it was grades. So F to A. So what does that say to you if you get an F? You're a failure. Like that's what we associated that with. And then if you got an A, you're like, ooh, I want to keep that up. So just the whole way that the construct of it is laid out from the very beginning, we're taught to have perfectionist tendencies because that's what the system's set up for. And the same at work, right? So you have evaluations. You want to be a high performer because when you have better performance, you get a merit increase. Like when you just look at the construct of everyday life, there's a lot of avenues that set you up that way.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it also comes from wanting to please others. Like that is, you know, when I peel back and look at it, you know, I was pushed to perfectionism in my performance. And I remember a time when, so I ended up playing college hockey, and I'm playing with players who were largely better than me from the surrounding states, somewhere from Alaska or Texas, Canada. So I'm playing with these players from all these different regions, trying to pick up on things and learn from them. But I remember specifically one time in practice, I was thinking, I really want to learn how to cut closer on my inside edge when I'm coming around on a play like this, but I don't want to try it here in case I fall.
Yep.
And like, that is so backwards. Like, practice is for you to try things that in a game you wouldn't try for the first time because obviously we want to win or whatever. But I remember thinking, I don't want to screw up, not even in practice. I never want there to be a moment when I'm on the ice where I fall and look stupid because I quote unquote failed at doing a new technique or whatever. And that's when I realized, like, what are you even doing? You're not even growing anymore because you're afraid to try new things. And once you stop being able to try new things and be okay that you don't get it right on the first time because, you know, it's your first time doing it, that's when your growth starts to get stunted, and you kind of have to revisit, like, what am I even doing here? What am I trying to get out of this journey?
That's really true. And so thinking about people pleasing, when I stripped it away for myself, mine came from two places. The first place was definitely people pleasing, because at the end of the day, I didn't want one to think I was dumb. I didn't want them to think I was stupid. I didn't want them to think I wasn't capable. So when you strip that back a step further, so you have perfectionism up here, strip it down halfway, people pleasing, at least that's how it was for us. And then when I stripped it down even further than that, it's because I carried all of my self-worth through other people.
Yeah, totally.
I'm going to say that again. It's a big deal. I was carrying my self-worth of what I thought and felt about myself through the lens of other people. And that is super dangerous. What happens when someone thinks you suck? Or what happens when someone says something hurtful, and maybe it's someone you look up to, like a boss or a mentor, or maybe it's not even hurtful, but just something that chips away at what you thought you were doing a good job at. And so for me, that got really dangerous and really intense. I think it was a year ago or a couple of years ago. But
I think it was a couple of years ago.
Yeah, basically I got to the point where I was like, I have to rediscover who I am and what my value and self-worth is from my point of view, because letting other people drive it, when I made a big transition in my life, I had a big fallout and I didn't even know who the hell I was. Yeah. And that's because I put all of my energy into being a perfectionist in my work that I did. So I just think it's really critical that people know, like, you cannot put your definition of yourself. It can't come from your significant other. It can't come from your family. It can't come from your colleagues. Like, you have to be strong and solid in what you are and what you believe about yourself.
Well, and when you base it on what other people are thinking about you, creates an incredibly volatile environment for your confidence.
Oh, for sure.
Your confidence gets whiplash.
Yeah.
Going back and forth because not everyone's going to like you. And so when you encounter that every day.
I didn't know that until 2 years ago. Just so, like, I was like, I am a friendly person and people will like me.
Yeah.
And you're right. Like, just sometimes it doesn't happen. And then the cool thing on the other side of that, once you start to build that awareness and confidence, I realized I didn't like everyone. And I was hanging out with people that I didn't want to because I didn't want them to think badly about me or speak badly about me. And like, this was one of the biggest pieces of work I had to do in my life because I had to undo these habits of people pleasing and showing up to everything and making sure I had good interactions. And there should have been times where I stood in my truth when I didn't believe things were right.
Yeah.
But I was so focused on what are they going to say about me? What are they going to tell other people, that I was putting myself in bad energy, which ultimately in the long run was draining me and making me a not good person.
Well, and you also make decisions that you wouldn't necessarily align with if you weren't being pressured by people whose opinions you shouldn't care about, but you do care about.
When you're a people pleaser, you oftentimes bleed to whatever energy is in your circle, which is freaking exhausting.
Yeah.
Like once you are on the other side of it, I didn't know it at the time. I was just like, man, I don't want to hang out with people and I don't have energy. And a huge component of that was I was spending time and energy with people that I was bleeding to. And like, I couldn't have told you what my favorite movie was. Like,
Yeah.
I liked whatever that person liked.
Right.
And the technical term for a piece of this is codependency. Those were just some really big pieces, but it all goes back up the pillar to perfectionism.
Yeah. Well, when you talked about, for you, it was a career change that made you kind of lose that sense of self. Mm-hmm. For me, it was when I quit the hockey team and my entire world came crashing down. Mm-hmm. When I was 16, I was pretty hell-bent on going to the Olympics. And in women's hockey, it's basically college hockey and then the Olympics, and there's nothing else. Like there's no in between. You're either the best in the world or you stop at college. And I was pretty hell-bent on going. Mm-hmm. Even though I missed a pretty crucial part of instruction in my younger years. I had stopped playing for 5 years, but I didn't care. I was super determined. I was very ambitious. My high school coach told my mom that I had more ambition than he knew what to do with because I was constantly asking to do drills and I want to learn how to do this better. And, everyone else wanted to have fun and I wanted to be prepped for a college team. Mm-hmm. And so since I was 16, I sunk all of my spare time into it. I ate so healthy, especially for a 16-year-old. And so I was just grooming myself and grooming my body and honestly pushing my body very hard all the way through. And then, my college experience was not what I wanted it to be. I had a very unhealthy relationship with my coach. And I ultimately decided, it wasn't worth it and I needed to be done. And holy shit, did the bottom come out from under me. Mm-hmm. Because to me, I was like, I just gave up like all my dreams. I don't even know what I'm doing anymore. And
and you put all of your apples in one basket.
Yeah. And I didn't know how I was going to I didn't know how I was going to stand out anymore. Mm-hmm. And I was plenty smart. Rationally, I had a lot of attributes that would help me stand out and help me pursue new dreams. But in my mind, irrationally, the only way I was able to gain praise on a consistent basis was my athletic performance. And so when that went away, all of this, the world came out from under my feet and I was struggling and grasping for like what you were talking about when you're like, it can't come from anyone else. Mm-hmm. I didn't even know to turn inward at that point though. Right. I was like, where does it come from next?
Right.
Like, how do I perform next that will get me praise and how can I perfect it next? Right. And so, I didn't let any of my grades slip. I didn't, I was trying to be so perfect in all these different areas of my life and if any one of those slipped up, there was negative self-talk. I felt shitty about everything. And I was like, I'm not even good at anything. Like I should have just stuck with hockey, no matter how toxic it was for me. So it just became this really vicious cycle of here's where I'm getting my worth from. And if that goes away, even that wasn't enough of a wake-up call for me. I continued pushing my body. And then I started pushing my body and my mind. And my schedule was stupid packed. Like I would go from 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. every single day.
Yeah.
And that came from, I was trying to please everyone around me. I really wanted my coach to like me. He didn't. And I just sunk all that energy into pleasing everyone else around me.
Yeah.
And so whether that was, my classmates and doing the load of our group project or, my boss and saying, can you work extra shifts? Yeah, of course I can. Or I started doing my MBA work while I was still a senior in my undergrad studies because when it was offered to me, I was like, will this make you like me? Okay, let's do it. And so it was just another way that I could use perfectionism to kind of grab hold and control my world.
Well, and I think there's different layers to it. So we just talked about that external motivation of like, I want people to like me. I want them to think I'm good at something. But the bastard part of it is, once you are in that motion for so long, you start to do it yourself. And it makes no sense and you don't even catch it. So like, I'm thinking about when you and I we've taken multiple personality tests, and the number one I'm thinking about is the Enneagram. And I think both times I took it, I came out as a performer or an achiever. And every personality test I take, that's the most commonality, is the performer or the achiever.
Yeah.
And so it gets to the point where even like, so my first step was drowning out the people pleasing and like kind of pushing out that noise. But even when I worked really hard at that, and I still have to work hard at it, like, let me clarify, I'm not all the way through it, but I call myself a recovering perfectionist because it's a constant work. Just because you're cutting out perfectionism or reducing it, it doesn't mean you stop chasing goals and having ambitions. That's not what it means at all. It means that there's a balance in between, and you're giving yourself grace when you're not perfect, but you're still moving forward. And so we had a coaching call. Was that earlier this week? Last week?
Yeah.
Everything's blurring together.
Time's blurring together right
now.
now.
That the holidays are over, I'm very confused about life. So we had a coaching call and we were talking about pushing too hard and then dropping too low, right?
Yep.
Because sometimes on the other side of the perfectionism, you swing really high, and then when it doesn't go how you want it to, or you're exhausted from being in the perfectionist level, you drop all the way back down to the bottom, and it's really hard to find that middle area. And so the number one tool, I have two main tools I use. The number one tool I use for perfectionism, curbing it, is self-compassion. And so I wrote this down because I think it's really important. I wrote, self-compassion is the kryptonite to perfection. And I'll explain that a little bit. Self-compassion is acknowledging that the circumstances are happening and there's a reason for it and it's okay. So, for example, I wanted to run 5 miles. I realistically had only been running 2. I got through 3.5, and I was really disappointed with myself because I really, really thought I could do it. Self-compassion would be saying, man, you tried really hard to hit that 5-mile mark, but it's no wonder you felt really tired at 3.5 because your body's not trained for this, and that's okay. Does that mean I stop having the goal of 5 miles over and over? No, it just means that I'm acknowledging the circumstances and that it kind of makes sense. And so to take that a step further, on the coaching call, the person we were talking to was like, that kind of makes me nervous because if I don't push myself, then I stay down in this low spot. And so you did a great job of clarifying what self-compassion looks like in that context. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so self-compassion doesn't mean letting yourself off the hook or stop pursuing your goals or anything like that. Self-compassion is just identifying that it's okay or understandable that you're feeling the way you feel. You know, it doesn't mean that, let's say you're having a tough time at work. It doesn't mean that you're going to stop going to work. You can't stop going to work, but you can say to yourself, yeah, no wonder you're having a tough time. You feel pretty isolated at work, and that would be tough for anybody.
Now, how are you going to move past it?
Right.
What's the next step of it?
Right. So it's not saying like, oh man, poor you feel isolated at work, and so you're going to stop going. Like that's not it. It's saying, oh yeah, I could see how you feel that way. What do we do next?
Right.
How do we solve this? How do we move past this? And so I think that there is a really big difference, and I've never been taught to talk to myself like that, especially growing up in the athletic world, right? So it's always, you can do anything for 60 seconds. You can do, push harder, push harder, push harder. When I was 16 and I started training, I had no limits and I had no self-compassion, because what I was learning was from the athletic world, which was, no, you push until you fail. That's what it is, especially in like the personal training world and the weight world. And I was working with a personal trainer who literally, we would work my muscles to fatigue where I literally couldn't lift the weights anymore. And that meant that you had done a good job that day. And so I was literally being physically conditioned to go until failure. And I did. And then my body completely collapsed. My thyroid levels tanked. My adrenals burned out. My hormone panel was so depleted and my body was so chemically out of whack that I had less estrogen than the lowest level for a man. And I had the hormones of a postmenopausal 80-year-old woman.
Wow.
And I was 22. And so I had completely broken down with my thyroid not functioning, my adrenals not functioning. I already was struggling with the condition I was diagnosed with as a teenager, which was postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. But I didn't care about any of it because I was like, no, the proper way to do this is you push through anything. And so I pushed and I pushed, and finally my body pushed back, and I really didn't like it. And I've never felt so helpless and out of control because I couldn't do it. I could barely stay awake. All of my energy was zapped. It was not a good place. And so I think the only reason I learned my lesson was because I knew what it felt like when my body broke. And that's why I finally could say, hey, it's okay that you don't max out on this set. It's okay that you can't sprint anymore or you'll collapse. It's okay to stop when you feel tired and not when you collapse. So it took me a little bit longer to learn that, but praise Jesus, I did learn it because I have the mental fortitude to do anything. And it puts me in a really unhealthy place that I will push myself mentally and physically to do anything until I collapse.
And I would even challenge and say that mentality of just push through it, just keep going, goes outside of sports and the athletic field. Because the coaching call we had, we were talking about that. She said, okay, this self-compassion you're telling me about literally goes against everything I've ever been taught. Like, whether you feel like it or not, you get out of bed, you go. And I was like, oh, trust me, like that was my world too. So I think a lot of us were raised in that way. And now we have a society and a lot of the high level jobs, that's the mentality. Like you push through, you get up, whatever. And so it's just this really foreign concept to a lot of people. And I learned about this through a course I took. And I remember them talking about it. And she gave a really good example. She talked about someone who drinks alcohol to cope. So if they had a bad day or they're upset or whatever that may look like, they use alcohol to cope, and maybe they have been sober for 5 months and they have a relapse and they're really hard on themselves. They're really pissed off because they needed to be done drinking. That was the goal. They had gone to the meetings. And she said, what if you said to yourself, no wonder you had a drink, because that's how your body knows to feel better. And you are doing your best to self-soothe in the moment that you know how. You're soothing, which is a great skill. Good job. You're just doing it with something that's not healthy for your body. So this total reframe of like, no wonder that's what you did because you were trying to cope and get through it. But now let's move on to the healthy skill. So it's like this mind-blowing shift of you're like, wait, you're condoning the fact that you had alcohol when you said you were going to stop drinking. It doesn't mean it's okay. It doesn't mean you're encouraging it, but you're still identifying like, no wonder that's what happened because you were doing the best you could. And that for me, I remember going, could it really be that easy? Like, could it really be that easy to just in a moment of slip up or upset or whatever to really talk myself through it, give the self-compassion and move on? And I actually had a situation at work very recently where I made a mistake. It was a bigger mistake and I felt it kick in, right? So for me, my face gets hot and tingly, my tunnel vision kicks in. I remember I was on the phone with someone and I really needed to be writing down the details of what they said. And I literally couldn't retain anything. Like I could feel it coming. And so I paused the situation and I said, you know what, so-and-so, could I call you back just in like 10 minutes and we can finish this conversation? I need to take care of something and I'll call you back and I want to be present and focused. And she was like, yeah, of course. And so I literally had to sit there with myself in the moment, get myself out of fight or flight and use that self-compassion and say, it feels really scary that this was a big mess up, but look at all you've had on your plate this week. Your workload has been doubled/tripled from what it normally is. And there's going to be times of that. It's okay. I know it sucks, but it happened. And then it doesn't even have to be that justified. It could simply just be, Court, you're human.
Right.
Like you don't even have to like put all the strategy behind it. It's just you're human and humans make mistake and we screw up and it is what it is. And just giving myself that talk of self-compassion, I was like, all right, yep, it happened. I can't go back and change it. it's already over, like it's already happened. And before I did this work of moving through perfectionism and self-compassion, I would have ruminated over and over. I would have came home and not been able to sleep about it and wouldn't be able to stop talking about it. I owned it and I said, this is what happened. And I moved on from it. And that was something I could never do up until a couple of years ago. So it's super powerful to use self-compassion.
Yeah, and it's definitely not, just to draw that distinction, it's not condoning either, right? Like it's not saying, I'm glad you made the mistake, or yeah, it's fine if you relapse with drugs or alcohol. It's not fine. It's saying, no wonder that happened. How do we fix it and
Given
move
the
forward?
circumstances. Yeah.
Right. And so sometimes when you're hearing about self-compassion for the first time, it's easy to confuse condoning it because this is kind of a foreign concept.
So the other big tool I use in addition to self-compassion is fact-checking. And so if I am having a hard time deciphering whether perfectionism is seeping in or if I'm being ambitious, like if those lines start to blur, like you were the one that shared with me when we were talking about this, when I used to work at the center, how I would be like, I have to go in at 5 a.m. I have to stay till 7 p.m. because my work is overflowing and overpiling. And I literally would operate in that mode. And you were like, do you have to, or are you choosing to? Like, are you choosing for everything to be perfect? Like, are we talking about state regulations? Like, those lines were not separated for me.
Well, and I think it was like a justification too, because you used to say like, no, I'm not being like the families need me.
Yeah.
Like this is for the kids. This is for the kids. And that was your outlet. But truthfully, like you're saying, like the fact checking of it, is it for the kids?
Right. And so I think just having someone you can bounce that off of when you're not sure, when you get a little cloudy, someone who, like a good friend or your significant other, someone who understands, even a colleague, like having a colleague where you can be like, I feel like this is me pushing it to perfectionism and really just this would be okay. I have to catch myself doing that at work too. And type A, ambitious, overachiever, like that personality type usually will be the ones that take something and run with it instead of doing what's best for the team and maybe taking a step back and giving a piece of it but not doing the whole project. So just fact checking, like, is this something I need to do or something I'm choosing to do? Because then you're pulling that veil off a little bit and you're getting a second point of reference if you're not sure where you're at.
Well, and that reminds me of a technique that I use too, that we do it together, is the worst case scenario, which is actually from This Is Us. Yeah. So we loved when Randall would do that with his wife, Beth. And it's basically just kind of playing out the worst case scenario. This works for me a lot when I'm worried about what someone else is going to think of me if I say no to anything, right? So if they're like, hey, I need help with this. And, you know, in my head, I'm like, well, I want to please them and I want them to know that I'm capable and competent and I can do all of those things. So I'll say yes. And I've had to learn to say no, which still feels weird for me. It's still a very it'll take me about 7 times longer to craft a text to say no than it does to be like, yeah, sure. For me, saying, okay, if I say no, then what?
Right.
Well, then they're going to, worst case scenario, then they're going to be disappointed in me. Okay. And then what? Well, then they're not going to like me anymore. Okay. And then what? Well, then I wouldn't have them as a friend. And then what? And then what? Like,
you have other friends.
You have other friends.
And it would be sad and it would suck. But at the end of the day, like, you would be okay.
And it's truthfully not even...
The probability is low. But even if they did, then it's like, is that the kind of person...
Exactly. But that's also the kind of feeling that would have stopped me. Because I'd be like, and then...
We catastrophize. I think perfectionists tend to go from point A to point Z really fast. And even
if I say no, the world will collapse.
And even Counselor Dan, so we call it worst case scenario from This Is Us, but Counselor Dan does the same thing. Like, he'll say, okay, and then what? And he says it so casually. And I'm like, and then this would happen. Yeah. He's like, okay, and then
Me
what?
and you get really dramatic in our answers. And he's like, and. And a good example that I like to use back when he did this to me, because I don't necessarily get that worked up. I'm typically pretty regulated these days, but there was a particular time where I was worrying about finances and he was like, okay, so what happens then? And I was like, well, then we don't have money and we won't make our mortgage payment. And he's like, okay, and then what? And I was like, they take our house. And he was like, okay, how many bedrooms do you have? And I said 3. And he's like, could you rent one out? And I said, well, I don't want to, but and he's like, that wasn't the question.
Right.
And I was like, yeah, we could rent one out. And he's like, okay. And that room, could you pay half the mortgage? And I said, yeah. So you could rent it out for the other half. And I was like, yes. And he's like, so you're going to lose your house? And I was like, no. Like in my head, it was like this big dramatic, like, you're going to take everything away from me. And he's like, meh, how likely is that going to be that it actually happens? Because worst case scenario, you could do something to, in that case, keep your house. And he was right. We were very, very far from financial destruction, but.
Well, and I think that's another good example of fact checking, because when you're catastrophizing, which is usually a perfectionist tendency, there's a lot of steps in between that you might have missed because you're going so fast, or just someone else's perspective of like, okay, this is my worst case scenario plan. Can you look at this and see if there's anything else I missed? And the reason it's important to hit all of the spots in worst case scenario is because then you go back and find a solution. Like you go back in as far as you can to the beginning.
Intervene as early as possible.
Yes, you intervene. That's a great way to look at it. And then, so you don't want to miss steps because you want to find the solution faster.
Yeah.
So that's really good.
So the techniques that we use to help us combat that on a daily basis and in our decision-making processes is first of all, it takes a high level of self-awareness. Like you have to take a step back, slow down, look at what's happening in your mind, and then, do some of the techniques we just talked about, doing the fact checking. Start with yourself, but then you can do it with a trusted friend, colleague, family member, doing worst case scenario and backing that out, and then intervening as early as possible if you can see that worst case scenario coming down the pike. And also the self-compassion component of it, being able to calm down in the moment and give yourself a little bit of grace.
And the only thing I would add to that is finding what your perfectionism strips down to. So for us, the majority of it was people pleasing. So I think before you can do any of those steps, you have to figure out where it's coming from and why. Because once you can get to the root of it, then you can start to navigate it while using all of those tools, which I think is also very important.
I feel like perfectionism is being pinned to a wall. And you have to figure out what's pinning you to the wall.
Yes.
Is it other people's opinions of you? Is it your own tendency of this is the only way I'll get recognition? Is it, what is that piece that's pinning you to the wall? Because it's different for everyone, and perfectionism shows up differently for everyone, but it's still something that's deeply rooted in our society, our hustle society. And I think we went up that mountain and everyone prided themselves on how many hours they worked in a day, and, hashtag hustle lifestyle. Yeah, I know. It is
and
gross.
Life is so much better when you get to the other, when there's another side. Like, first of all, just knowing that awareness piece, you're like, oh, I don't have to work until I die, and I don't have to live this crazy life where everything has to be perfect. Like, knowing that. And then once you, again, we haven't mastered it, but I feel like we do a pretty damn good job. And that life and that freedom and that peace and that serenity feels so much different. And that's how I want to live my life.
Yeah. And I think a lot of companies are starting to turn that corner. And that's why you're seeing a lot more companies focus on the work culture. And, I just saw a list the other day of the top places that have awesome benefits or whatever. And one of them was like unlimited paid vacation days. Wow. And I was like, what? How do you even do that? But that's where companies are going, is understanding that the human psyche, we weren't meant to work all day,
We're not
every day.
Productive after a certain point.
Yeah, you
anyway.
sure aren't.
So the really cool thing about this is, I know we tackled perfectionism and people pleasing at a 10,000 foot view, but this is actually part of what we have built into our digital course that we're releasing this year. We've talked about it a little bit on social media, but that is our big 2020 release, is that we have spent the last 6 months of 2019 working really, really hard to bring you tips and tools and resources on how to navigate through some of these walls. Perfectionism is one of those walls, so you can continue to grow and build your best life. And so we are going to plug a link to that in the show notes. That way you guys can get on the wait list, because when that rolls out this spring, it's not something you're going to want to miss. So if you're like, wait, I need more information, I need more details, tell me how to do this. There's videos, worksheets, lots of really helpful tools. So we will dive into this. So if you struggle with perfectionism, people pleasing, or you know someone someone who does, send them this link so they can jumpstart and get a seat in the course, or at least get on the wait list. And we'll be releasing more details about it as we go. But this is one of the topics we cover in detail.
Yeah, and the reason that we ended up making a course or even outlining a coaching program is because so many people have come to us with the topics that we address on this podcast. And obviously in a 30-minute segment, when it's a one-sided conversation, you can't make a lot of meaningful progress. And so we really wanted to be able to work with people and help get them through these different things because, we can cover what we cover and we'll answer as many questions as we can afterwards, in the DMs and emails that we get. But we really wanted a chance to be able to work with people and kind of coach them and guide them through these topics that we're talking about. So we hope you enjoyed today's episode and got something helpful out of it. We love to hear from you and get your feedback. So head over to our social platforms on Facebook and Instagram at Life with Beth and Court. Send us a DM, comment on the post when we talk about this episode being released. And as we always say, take what's helpful, leave the rest. And until next week, my friends, keep building your best life.
Bye, guys. It was a one-eyed, one-horned, flying, perfect people pleaser. There it is. There it was.